Good afternoon, Dr. Pakaslan and Dr. Ramesh Sharma. Thank you very much for inviting me to the 4th International Conference on Virtual Reality 2022 at the Haran University. Please give me a minute to start my video presentation. I hope you can see my screen, and let me begin. My professional practice has been in the design, development, facilitation, and research of simulation games for almost 20 years. Almost every aspect of my practice needs to consider players' engagement. A player is a user, client, and customer, and is the reason for the success of the games. My presentation will cover the nature and significance of engagement in games. What is common to any game will also apply to VR games. Fun, pleasure, and satisfaction are some of the aspects of engagement. Despite overlapping meanings, they have important implications for emotion-rich products like games and VR experiences. Today, in my presentation, I will use the language of game players, which can be later applied to VR and other domains of human efforts as well. For convenience, I will use the words he and his in reference to individuals, with no offense to anyone in using these words. I gratefully acknowledge the contributions of authors and researchers whose names have been mentioned in this presentation. Let me begin with flow, the expression coined by the late Csikszentmihalyi for the state of consciousness when a person is so engrossed in what he is doing that his senses ignore all other stimuli around him. How does that happen? It happens when the player has equal opportunities for action, equal in the sense, equal to the abilities for him to act. The player therefore reaches flow when his abilities exactly match the complexity of the situation in the game. His highest flow experience is not when he solves easy problems, but when the problems are difficult and complex, and yet he manages to solve those problems. This forces him to learn skills and makes him very pleased with himself. Therefore, the flow state is one where the player is curious about what is around him. He is always alert to respond to the stimulus around him. He is conscious of trying to find a new way of responding to these challenges and problems. He is creative. Because he has solved these problems, he is immediately happy. He is also happy because he is engrossed in that experience. He is so engrossed that he is forgetful of everything else around him. A flow state is what one of the contributors of engagement and how it will contribute to the success of the game. How can VR game designers learn from the flow concept? They could develop products that offer challenges that match the competence of the player. For example, Sudoku is a familiar game which is available in at least 3 different difficulty levels. Let's move on to a common word called fun. Fun is an emotion that we all understand, but find it difficult to explain because it happens in different situations. The best and the simplest description that I know of comes from Coster. Let me read it out for you for full impression. Fun in games arises out of mastery, comprehension, and it is the act of solving puzzles that makes game fun. Learning is the drug in the fun because it is something that you get addicted to. Costa basically says fun is an emotional response to learning. Costa's fun emerges from superior understanding and application of learning to solve problems. He also implied that fun is discovery from learning. To understand Costa better, I went deeper and found some answers in the popular Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives. The taxonomy had different aspects of learning outcomes, such as recognition, interpretation, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, and innovation that any player would experience as a natural offshoot of his engagement with the game. Let us see what we can learn from applying fun in our games. Number one, if the player learns something new, the player is going to experience fun. The second conclusion is not so obvious because there are at least 6 different learning effects, according to Bloom, that produce fun. Plus, it also becomes an output of the activity and engagement of the player. In the sense, I repeat the words, they produce recognition of the stimuli around him. The student learns to interpret his experience. He applies what he has learned. He is able to analyze his own experience. He can put things together and create new things, and he can evaluate the experiences and events that happen to him. There is one more conclusion that's important, and you will find it difficult to accept it at first glance. You could probably relate it to your own schooling, education, and training. And what is this third conclusion from fun? Most of the learning is neither visible nor felt during or immediately at the end of the game. It takes time to be able to use what you experienced in the game. The player is eager to apply his discoveries, maybe more than once, and sometimes may create conditions for his own learning. If he fails to use his learning at that time, his inability will frustrate him in a very beneficial way to create enough creative tension to motivate him subconsciously. And of course, that search for learning will take forever. Here on the screen, you can see one more opinion about fun. Catherine Price was interviewed on the McKinsey in April 2022, where, as the author of a book, she explained that fun was at the intersection of 3 elements. One was playfulness, the second was connection, third is flow. We have already understood flow as a state where the player forgets everything else but the game because of his engagement with what is happening to him. Playfulness is basically the freedom that he gets to play according to the rules of the game, which means if the rules of the game are framed well, he gets enticed into playing and learning throughout the game. A second issue is that of connection. He needs to feel connected not only to the rules and the challenges of the game, but also to other people such as competitors and collaborators and colleagues and team members in the game. If these three elements of fun are put together, you can expect, according to Price, happiness, productivity, and resilience. These are different kinds of outcomes, but they emerge from the learning that happens when you participate in such a level that you feel engaged with the game. Let me come to the third issue, the third element of fun, and of course, how to produce engagement in the game. Last year, I partnered with Dr. Jigyasu Dubey and Dr. Upinder Dar to understand player satisfaction from a large sample of 600 players, where 550 were students, adult students, and 50 were older adults. These adults had played a variety of indoor and outdoor games alone and sometimes in teams as well. Some games were typical board games like chess or outdoor games like football. There were many players who had also played online games such as PUBG and so on. From a scale of 28 statements, we extracted 5 factors that collectively represented what we called player satisfaction. That means how and why a player feels or experiences satisfaction in a game. These are the factors that you can see in front of you. Our paper was first presented at the International Conference of the International Simulation and Gaming Association last year, and later published by Springer. According to our research, we discovered that these 5 factors come together to produce player satisfaction. Of course, depending upon the game, depending upon the context of the game in such as, for example, the learning goal or the accomplishment goal, depending upon the nature of competition, depending upon whether you're playing alone or whether it's an online game and so on, some of the contributions of these factors may differ from one another. However, they would be subjected to the player's involvement in the game. Collectively, they produce player satisfaction, which is an important element for us to understand what exactly we mean in terms of engagement in the game. So what did we find? First of all, our preparatory research that led to our study showed these as some of the elements that produce player satisfaction in a variety of contexts. One is that how easy is the game to play? Does it have too many restrictions and controls? Is the language difficult to understand? A second, freedoms and controls. What can you do and what can you not do? It's important to add constraints because they are the ones that become challenges for the player. And of course, it excites him. If there are no freedoms, if there are no controls and constraints, then he is likely to find the game too easy and he will not reach flow. A third, how deeply is his participation in terms of his own role in the game, especially in team games? Is it an important element that he is there? Does he is doing something active all the time? And so on. A fourth is performance. What is required to do? Performance includes process as well. How must he do it? What are the rules that stop him from doing that? Competitiveness. Of course, this is an element that sometimes urges us to play better, but it does not have the same effect on everybody. It probably scares some players and maybe encourages others. So therefore, we need to find the right kind of player and fit it to the right kind of game. What is the level of interactions amongst the players? These interactions actually contribute very strongly to the engagement in the game. If you have seen open games, public games, or outdoor games such as football and hockey, and of course, games where there are lone players like badminton and tennis, you would understand what I mean in terms of interactions. And of course, finally, the linchpin, the biggest effort, the biggest factor that contributes to engagement of all kinds is learning. At the end of the game, during the game, what did I understand so that I can take this experience forward? With respect to electronic games, which is very important to VR games in particular, there were another set of elements that contributed to satisfaction. You can see them here. One is, of course, one element is something that we already understand. The one that we are discussing here today is engagement. How truly engaged, connected to the challenges in the game is an important element of player satisfaction. Narrative. A typical VR game has a story. It begins somewhere with a problem and ends with its solution. And maybe along the way, you have milestones and you have mini challenges, and so characteristic of first-person shooter games and so on. Then you have discovery. Of course, discovery is another word for learning. But basically it says, are you shocked and stunned and amazed at something that happened anew? Is something novel in what you have experienced? Well, that is discovery. Does it make you sit up and take notice? Fantasy. Some players want a fantasy in the game. They want to be taken apart, put into the future, for instance, and so that they can be amazed at what happens. Some people want something very real. So you need to find how to offer something of different kinds of fidelity to the participant so that he plays well. A player who wants fantasy and you give him something real may be put off by the excessive amount of realism in the game. Sensation. Sensation, of course, is there. You will find that this is overlapping everywhere. Sensation is just another word for an emotional outcome. A sensation could also be a provocation to get the participant to play more. Competition is a real strong element in satisfaction. In VR games and otherwise, electronic games and otherwise, everybody seems to want to win over others. And if you can add learning into it, that's great. Immersion, of course, is another word for flow. And that basically means, can you get the person to be so engrossed in what is happening around in the games for the player? And I think if you can do that, you have a player who's totally satisfied with the game. Lastly, of course, the game features. How complex is it? How simple is it? I mean, compare snakes and ladders to something more complex like a game like Catan or chess, for instance, and you will have a range of games that can be properly targeted against children or adults, as the case may be. At this stage, I will broadly talk about, point out also how players can be categorized by their motivation. I will not try to, let's call him Mark. In 2015, he particularly referred to 6 types of, we will call them roles of players, and why they play the games they do. This is also a reason for playing games and therefore must be considered by all game makers. We have philanthropists who play for a purpose. Uh, there are games like fish banks. The purpose is to help people understand how to use a common resource. Games where participants like to play with others, relatedness. I mean, why do cricket players want to play together? They can depend on each other. There is interactions. There is challenge within each other. There's connection within. So that is one reason people want to. I mean, we are all social animals. We need to connect. Free spirits is probably the opposite of relatedness. So a tennis player might say that I don't want to team up with anybody. And you will find this kind of elements also with respect to chess, which is a familiar game. Then there is achievers, people who would like to try out their competence. Can I do this next time? So with respect to the Sudoku I mentioned, there may be a player who wants to move from the easy level to the median, the mid level where it's not so hard. And maybe somebody who's conquered that wants to go to the harder element or the more difficult or the most difficult level of Sudoku. So therefore he wants to show and that he can be competent as well. He wants to increase and learn further from whatever he is doing. And the players who are interested by rewards. You have professional players and you have the amateurs. So therefore, people who play for money, for instance, they are of course goaded by competition as well, because the competition is a good measure of how rewards can be offered. Then finally, you have people who would like to be conscious about how to make change. There are strategy games where people can create something new. And this would probably be more attractive to the older players because they would like to, the more senior adults, for instance. Now, this list is not a complete list. I'm sure you can find more with your experience. And it is important that if you can find what is the role that the player wants to play, I think you will be able to offer the right kind of motivation for the player to play the game. I'll just go back a little and let us see what we meant by fun and learning. So how do we go? Because this is probably a very important element that we have to find and how to get the player involved in such a way that he stays there for a long time. Therefore, fun is something that we must be able to explain because the context of the player will be able to differentiate two players participating in the same game, but with different levels and nature of fun. So let's more or less summarize. Engagement in games, as we have seen so far, is a complex mix of at least three elements. We have looked at fun, offered by Coster as something emerging from learning. We have looked at flow, an idea, a state, an emotional state defined by Csikszentmihalyi, who proposed that flow is a place where a person forgets himself, forgets everything else, and is totally involved and engrossed in what's happening around him. A state that we game makers would like our players to experience. And finally, satisfaction, which we proposed, we found in our research as being elements of, a collection of 5 elements. When you put them together, you have satisfaction. Of course, the level of satisfaction will depend upon what kind of games the player is playing. But then we have a fourth element. Is there a fourth source of engagement in the games? I think we need to find that. But hopefully, fun, flow, satisfaction will cover most of the elements of the game. We have, of course, the outcome of engagement. It produces interest, so therefore the player plays repeatedly. And of course, he recommends the game to others. So therefore, that's very important for a business perspective. So let me summarize. What do we understand from engagement in games and how do we apply it to VR? Here we see that fun is basically driven by activity and sometimes by interactions, and of course, challenges as well. We have seen engrossment, and it is triggered by offering players a problem as a challenge which he wants to solve. It is sometimes related to means, that means a process as to what he's doing, sometimes related to the goals that he wants to achieve. Competitiveness enhances and becomes a very real reason. And therefore, the player wants to play. But sometimes the challenge is the competition. The player wants to play himself. He wants to become better than yesterday. So when you talk about competition, we are not looking at the competitor as another person in the game itself. We have control, that is restricting the player from not doing these things, those other things, and so on, such as, for example, the scoring rate and so on. As much as encouraging the participant to play, an important element is feedback, progress metrics, we have leaderboards and so on. And finally, a person's characteristic, his personality drives the kind of person he is, the types, and therefore he plays as a competitor, a learner, as an extrovert. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this presentation has would make sense in terms of how to play, how to make better games, whether ordinary games or games in VR. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.